Hello, good afternoon everybody. You're all very welcome. Delighted to see a nice turnout. Sometimes these lunchtime talks, you know, you can be standing here talking to a person and it's a little bit awkward. So it's lovely to have a nice crowd here for today's talk. And I'm not surprised because Matthew is a great speaker. You give him any subject, he'll turn it into something really interesting. Because everything has its own kind of levels or areas of interest, really. So I'm seeing now that I might actually need to go and grab a few extra chairs. Now, the Lifelong Learning Week Festival, of course, is on, and that's why this talk is on. I'm not sure how many events are taking place today. I had a look yesterday. I think it was 18 different things were happening yesterday. Might have been 14, I can't remember exactly. I think it was 18 though. So there's probably a similar range of things happening around today and for the rest of the week. So make sure you have a look at the Lifelong Learning Festival programme. So I'm really delighted to welcome Matthew. Of course, he's a colleague. Matthew is the curator of Limerick Museum, and we've worked together many times in the past. So it's always a pleasure to have him here. And I'm going to let you take over, Matt. I'm going to go grab a few more chairs.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that. Mike's quite right in saying that we are colleagues because actually the museum now is part of the library service. It's the department's called the Library, Museum and Gallery of Art section, so it works very well because we're all in the same cultural area. So I'm just going to talk today then about the history of Limerick Museum. Now this is a topic that hasn't really been explored before, but I completed an MA last year on the history of, on museum practice and management, and part of it was a minor thesis, and I picked the history of the museum for my subject, and my intention is that in the future I'll probably publish this in the form of a book on the history of Limerick Museum. So, you know, of course, now that Limerick Museum is situated in the Franciscan Friary in Henry Street, and we're there since 31st of May of 2017, so we're almost 2 years in that building now. But of course, many of you also know that the museum had quite what could be called a peripatetic existence before that. It moved around Limerick quite a bit. And my predecessor Brian Hodkinson used to say that it was a sort of a pop-up museum before the term was actually invented. And that's the official opening 2 years ago, of the Limerick Museum. So I'll just start very briefly by giving an account of the history of museums in general. I'll make this pretty brief now because we'll get straight into the history of the Limerick Museum soon after. So, a museum may be defined as an institution that houses and displays a collection of objects of artistic, cultural, scientific or historical importance. And of course art galleries are also museums. They're not often called that in Europe, but they are. In America they tend to call art galleries art museums. So if you define art galleries to be museums, then Limerick City and County Council actually has 2 museums under its jurisdiction, namely here and the Limerick City Gallery of Art in Perry Square. Now they can be privately or publicly owned. In America, North America, they're usually privately owned. In Europe, they tend to be publicly owned. Now the word itself is of Greek origin and refers to a temple or institution under the protection of the Muses, goddesses who were believed to inspire the creation of the arts. And of course the famous prototype of all museums was the Museum of Alexandria in Egypt, and it was established by the Greek rulers of Egypt, the Ptolemies, in the 3rd century BC. And the famous Museum of Alexandria was more a research institute, really, in that it included the famous Library of Alexandria and a museum. But the museum and the library were really for the use of the scholars that were gathered there by the kings, the Ptolemy kings of Egypt. So they weren't public institutions in the manner that we understand a museum. So museums and art galleries were widespread in the Roman Empire, but then disappeared for nearly 1,000 years. And then they were revived at the time of the Italian Renaissance. Originally the word gallery was used to describe the long narrow rooms in Renaissance houses and palaces used to exhibit the owner's art collection. And that's origin of the modern term art gallery. So these privately owned museums and art galleries were often open to visitors that want a limited scale. And there, of course, is one of the prototypes of this period, the Vatican museums. But the modern museums, such as Limerick Museum, the modern museum actually developed at the time of the French Revolution. When the French monarchy was overthrown, the Louvre Museum was opened in Paris with free access to all classes. And of course, the Louvre had been previously one of the principal residences of the French kings, although they hadn't lived there very much. For 100 years before the French Revolution, they lived in the Palace of Versailles for the most part. But the model set by the French then was followed all over Europe. Many royal art collections were then transformed into national galleries of art or museums. And municipal museums and art galleries then appeared. They were owned by the city council, and they became very widespread in the 19th century all over Europe. And indeed, the 19th and early 20th century is often called the Museum Age. And the prototype, as I said, of the modern museum is the Louvre in Paris. Purpose is then that the 19th century museum was thought to be a very important public institution, because there was a lot more leisure time available for people as a result of the French Revolution or the Industrial Revolution. For the first time ever, there was leisure time for the non-elite classes, because if you worked in a factory, while you did work long hours, you also had defined hours. And as the 19th and 20th centuries progressed, of course, working hours tended to be curtailed and more leisure time became available. Now, a lot of the upper and middle classes were afraid, and that the working classes, so-called, if they hadn't anything to do during these periods of leisure, they would get up to mischief, idleness and immorality. So they thought then that municipal museums and art galleries would be very useful as an alternative to the, as they would have said at the time, the tavern. And not only that, they improved public taste, they promoted the arts, and in many cases they fostered a sense of patriotism. Now, if we come at last to the Irish situation, local authority museums proliferated in Britain, of course, but not so much in Ireland, because of the, I suppose, the poverty of a lot of the local authorities. And when you look at what was the first city in Ireland to have a municipal museum and art gallery, of course it was Belfast, which was a wealthy industrial city. But then here in Limerick, we don't realise perhaps that we have a great distinction. We were the second city to establish a municipal museum, which was established, it says there, 1906, but it's actually January 1907. And if you looked at Cork, established a museum after that of Limerick, but it was burned down by the Black and Tans in 1920. So that from 1920 to 1943, Limerick had the only local authority museum in the whole of Ireland, of the Free State, later the Republic. So, I mean, that's something we don't actually talk about much in Limerick. So we're actually a very pioneering city in the provision of these sort of cultural facilities. If you look at that, Waterford had a museum from 1943 to 47, but it closed down and had to be re-established in 1955. So Limerick was way ahead in terms of having a local authority museum. And even still, by the year 2000, and it hasn't changed since then, there were only 12 local authority museums in the state. When I say local authority museum, of course, I mean a museum that's funded and provided by the local authority. So, for example, there is one in each of the 6 counties of Munster. And then there's one each in Louth, in Monaghan, in Cavan, and in Donegal. So that makes 10. And the other 2 then are in Galway and in Carlow. So you can see there's huge parts of the country don't have any local authority museums. So Limerick's first museum then. Very interesting, the early history of museums in Limerick was they were actually voluntary bodies. Because in the early 19th century, remember I said that the whole idea of museums was to raise public taste, to promote the arts, to keep the so-called working classes out of mischief and so on. These ideas, of course, were also prevalent in Ireland at the time. And in the early 19th century, it was stated that Limerick was very much in need of a public museum. And to that end, a voluntary body was established called the Limerick Philosophical and Literary Society. It existed from 1840 to 45, and it was, as one would expect, largely a creation of the local gentry. And if you name check the name, if you look at the names that were involved, it's the usual suspects, you might say. Sir Aubrey de Vere of Cork Chase was the president. He was the father of the poet Aubrey de Vere. And the three vice presidents were Sir Lucius O'Brien of Dumoulin Castle, William Smith O'Brien of Carmoyle, who was the brother of Sir Lucius, and William Monsell of Tervu of Clarina, whom I, of course, have made a study of. So it's that four kept turning up in just about everything that was happening in Limerick at this period. And they decided they would open a public museum. Now, when I say public, it was not going to be free of charge, it was going to be a nominal fee. But they actually went to the trouble then of building an entirely new structure to house it. And this is the building here, Limerick's first museum. It was situated across from what is now the Glentorrot Hotel, or the whatever it's called now, Perry Hotel. And it later became known as Havergill Hall. And it was built in 1843. And it contained exhibition space, lecture theatre, meeting rooms, the whole lot. So it was a very ambitious building. And it opened to the public then in 1843. The trouble was, of course, that it was not in receipt of any, or very much at least, public funding. And as a result, within 2 years, it was forced to close because the building was far too large and too expensive. And even an affluent group of people, such as Sir Aubrey de Vere and his colleagues, just hadn't the funds to keep it going. And it had to close in 1845. Then another society was established to replace the Limerick Philosophical Society. This new society was called the Limerick Society for the Promotion of Literary, Scientific and Industrial Education, known for short as the Limerick Society. And they had much the same mission statement, as it were, as the first one, which was to build and operate a museum. And again, the same group, more or less, as before, were in charge. This time, my old friend William Monsell was the president. His brother-in-law, Lord Adair, later the third Elder Raven, was one of the vice presidents. The other vice president then was William Smith O'Brien. And this time there was a representative from the, I suppose, the municipal elite, outside the landed gentry, Dr. Robert Kane, who was a medical doctor and later served as Mayor of Limerick. They were fortunate that they had the same building. They didn't have to build a building, so they took over the lease of this. It was known as the Philosophical Rooms, actually, rather grandly. And this time it was even less successful than the first time round. It only lasted a year, 1848 to 49, and then it closed. Of course, I don't have to point out to you that these two experiments coincided with the Great Famine, probably the biggest economic crisis that Ireland faced in the 19th century, or perhaps any other century for that matter. So, to say the least of it, their timing wasn't the best. But that wasn't the end of attempts to establish some sort of museum in Limerick in the 19th century. In 1853, the Limerick Athenaeum was proposed by William Lane Joint. This was a sort of an adult education body, which also contained lecture theatres, meeting rooms and so on. And that was established, of course, in Cecil Street. It opened in 1855, where the Royal Cinema is now, where the Royal Cinema used to be, I should say. Now, initially, Lane Joint's mission statement was for, again, a library and museum, but it never happened. And however, the Athenaeum did feature two very important temporary art exhibitions in the 19th century, one in 1866 and one in 1863. The 1866 exhibition was opened by Sir Peter Tate, the then Mayor of Limerick, and also, of course, proprietor of Limerick Clothing Factory. And the 1883 exhibition was opened by my old friend William Monsell, who by now was the first Baron Emily. Now, the paintings for these temporary exhibitions were borrowed from the South Kensington Museum in London, which later became the Victoria and Albert Museum, and also from a lot of the local gentry. So again, Monsell the De Veres, and many of the others lent paintings. What's interesting about these two exhibitions is that the paintings that were on display at these, they were temporary exhibitions, so they lasted for a few months in each instance, but they were probably the most, it was the largest collection of expensive and prominent paintings ever accumulated in one place in Limerick. So during the course of these two exhibitions, paintings by Rembrandt, by Hals, by Sir Joshua Reynolds, Poussin, Van Dyck, Turner, and Constable were all on display. And these, as I say, were on loan. But I mean, you could imagine that Limerick never again was to have such an array of splendid paintings gathered on exhibition. So, as I say, the Athenaeum operated then, as I say, as a very, very occasional temporary exhibition space. There was then one last, well, actually, it was earlier than the others. There was a body then called the Limerick Institution, which operated in 99 Georgian Street, now O'Connell Street. In fact, it's now where Rooney Auctioneers is. And from 1809 to 1964, they also existed as a sort of a learned society. And they also contemplated setting up a museum, but they never did, probably because of the disastrous failure of the other two efforts in Havergill Hall, as it was later called. So there was often sarcastic remarks made about the Limerick Institution, that was a languid institution, this was only a place you came to read newspapers and so on. What's interesting about it, though, is that the objects that had been gathered for the earlier museums of the 1840s were actually taken to the Limerick Institution after the failure of these early bodies, these early museums. But nobody knows, at least I don't yet anyway, what became of these objects. So then, that was the end of the attempts to establish institutional museums. Really, 1840s was the end of that. Voluntary bodies, I should say. But of course, private collections continued to be accumulated by local antiquarians, of whom perhaps the most distinguished in the 19th century was the third earl of Dunraven. We met him earlier as Lord Dare, brother-in-law of William Monsell and one of the vice presidents of the Limerick Society of the second museum, we'll call it. And he accumulated a fine collection of antiquaries throughout his life, and these later indeed were donated to Limerick Museum and formed a large and significant part of the collection. But there were other famous collectors, or I should say distinguished collectors. Unfortunately, they're not very famous nowadays, but people like Father Timothy Lee, who was a local Catholic priest, Archdeacon John Begley, the author of the history of the diocese, Dr. George Fogarty, a medical doctor, and Patrick J. Lynch, who was a local engineer. And also then, of course, a pressure group, a sort of a constituency for the establishment of a museum also came into existence in the late 19th century, and that was the Limerick Field Club, which came into existence in 1892 and lasted until 1913. And from that, there then also grew a society called the North Munster Archaeological Society, which became defunct in 1919, but it was then revived in 1929 as the Thomond Archaeological Society, now the Thomond Archaeological Historical Society. And the significance of this particular body was, if you count the three of them as being essentially the one organisation, was that one, it provided a pressure group. You know, there was this constituency in Limerick of learned men and indeed some women as well, but it has to be said there were mainly men at this period who were in favour of establishing a museum in Limerick. And secondly, many of these individuals were private collectors, as I've already stated, and they were their donations were essential to the establishment of the museum collection. So now we come to the Limerick Museum at long last, you might say. As we know now, it's one of the largest local authority museums in the country. In terms of its collection, there's over 60,000 items, and the majority can be viewed in the online catalogue, and is of course dedicated to the late Jim Kemmy. Now, it was actually founded in 1907 to be precise, and we'll talk about that now in a minute. how it came about really was a chapter of accidents, in that in 1893, Limerick Corporation, as it was called at the time, Limerick City Council, established the first municipal library in Limerick. That is, a library run by the local authority. And again, of course, that's a separate lecture, but there was a prehistory there as well, various voluntary attempts to establish a library and so on. The lesson to be learned from the failure of both the voluntary libraries and the voluntary museums was that, like it or lump it, the local authority was the only institution capable of establishing and funding a library or an art gallery or museum that was that enjoyed continuity and longevity. And that's something I think, again, that should be emphasised, that the local authority system in Ireland has provided most of the cultural institutions outside of Dublin over the past century or so. So the municipal library had been established in 1893 in Denford Street, but then in 1903, following the securing of a grant from Andrew Carnegie, it was decided to move to Perry Square, which is now the location, of course, of the Limerick City Gallery of Art. But of course, there was a shortage of funds, and the City Council decided that in order to raise funds for the upkeep of the library, they would have to strike another rate. In other words, what would now be called another property tax. And so for this purpose, they adopted a piece of legislation called the Museums and Gymnasiums Act of 1891. In those days, there were often acts of Parliament brought in. They weren't compulsory. A town council or a city council could actually vote to adopt the act, or they mightn't bother. Most of them, of course, didn't bother, as it turns out. But in the case of Limerick, they decided if they adopted this act and raised a rate, they would generate an extra £140 a year. And of this £140, £70 would go to the library, and £70 would go to the museum. So really, the reason data there was to raise money for the library. But of course, the local history community, personified, as I said already, by the various by the members of the Limerick Field Club and so on, they sort of said, we actually should establish a museum with this money. So it was decided that a museum would be established. Now, this is the building in question. We now know it as the Limerick City Gallery of Art, but it was opened in 1906 as the Carnegie Free Library. And many of you are probably familiar with the fact that it was, in its early incarnation, it was the library downstairs and the museum upstairs, and then later, of course, it became the museum in its entirety. Sorry, the library in its entirety. So, one of the Limerick Field Club and one of the local collectors, called Patrick J. Lynch, he was sent on a fact-finding trip, and he went to the National Museum in Dublin and a few other such places, and he produced a report which he brought to the Library Committee, which was the body that actually administered the library at this period, and he recommended the establishment of a museum. And on the 31st of January 1907, the Library Committee voted to establish a museum. So you could say that was the birthday of Limerick Museum, 1907, 31st of January. And to mark the occasion then, they changed their name then to the Library and Museum Committee. So, in the meantime, a man called Patrick J. McNamara had been appointed director and curator of the Museum and Art Gallery. And he wasn't the first, of course, librarian. That had been a man called Patrick Hogan in the 1890s. But he was the first curator of the museum. And until 1977, the curator of the museum was the librarian. The librarian was ex officio curator of the museum. Now, as a result of the very small income generated by the museum rate, the museum was dependent on donations for its collection. So they voted to open a museum in 1907, but it didn't open until 1916. And the intervening 9 years were spent in putting together a collection and also in working out how they could actually fund the actual building once it opened. Now here you see a number of images of the museum. in the mid-20th century. And the room in question was on the first floor. It measured about 53 foot by 25 foot, so it wasn't a huge room by any means. But the point is that the actual donations came in at a great rate. The very first items that came into the museum in 1907 included what were described in the minutes as 2 old banknotes, an old stone font, and then perhaps the most famous object that arrived in at that very early stage, I think it was about the third object to arrive, was the nail, which is of course on display over the museum. Many of you are familiar with the table, stone table with a metal top, which was used to pay bills, and hence the term pay on the nail. Now it strikes me from reading the minutes that it had been in the City Hall for a long number of years in Rutland Street. I would imagine that they were glad to see the back of it, and that once the museum opened they thought, this is our chance now. So it was sent packing over to the museum almost within weeks of the museum being established. The donations kept coming in then, and to the point that by 1918, only a couple of years after it opened, the museum was already overcrowded. So there was always a problem with storage. And once the collection had reached a certain point, then there was a necessity to get information about how to actually display the objects. And at one stage, Count Plunkett, the father of Joseph Mary Plunkett, who at that stage was the director of the National Museum in Dublin, he sent one of his colleagues down to advise the museum committee, the library museum committee, about how it was done. And some of those cabinets that you see there, and I'll show you a few more images now, these were sourced around this time by our friend Patrick J. Lynch, who played a very important voluntary role in the whole business. And then, and this is reminiscent of course of some of the current discussion, then there was public disquiet then. Why isn't the museum open? At the moment we have a bit of debate about extending the opening hours. So by 9:13 they actually wanted the museum to open, full stop. It wasn't a question of opening longer, it was just to open. Because everybody was aware of course that that the museum had been established in 1907 and so on. So after considerable discussion in 1913, it was decided that the director of the library, who was the curator of the museum, if on application was the term to use, in other words, if you asked him, he would show people around the museum between 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock each day. So it was limited opening hours. But then in 1916, a clamour arose from the local trades council, and in response to their representations, it was decided then to open the museum on a full-time basis. When I say full-time basis now, in fact, it was open regular hours, but very limited regular hours, 6 hours per week. And the problem there was, you see, that there was no separate staff for the museum. So it was the library staff who actually manned the museum as well. Now, again, it cannot be emphasised that while all of this sounds pretty modest, it was actually one of only three municipal museums in the country at the time. Belfast had its municipal museum, but then Belfast was a very wealthy industrial city, but its municipal museum eventually became what's now the Ulster Museum, which is effectively the National Museum of Northern Ireland. Cork's museum had been founded the year after Limerick's one, 1908. It opened earlier though, in 1910, but it was destroyed, as I say, by the Black and Tans in 1920, when they also destroyed the City Hall in Cork and a good bit of the city centre. So effectively then, from 1920 to 1943, for all its faults, for all the fact that it was open limited hours and it was underfunded, it has to be said that the Limerick Museum was the only one of its type in the entire state. So I think that's something, to be fair, to be proud of. And we managed to keep the doors open throughout that period, albeit for very limited hours. And while the rate of donations didn't continue on the scale that they had done before at the opening, there were still some important donations. So, for example, in 1920, the William Smith O'Brien chair, which many of you remember being on display, which is now in storage, was donated by Dermot O'Brien, who was William Smith O'Brien's grandson and at that stage was president of the Royal Hibernian Academy. Then in 1939, and this is now the photograph here of the little boys, is kind of from that period. In 1939, a man called Robert Herbert became the city librarian, and also de facto curator of the museum. Now, McNamara had been in the office for 32 years or so, and he had become demoralised by the lack of interest and the lack of funding and all the rest of it. And he retired in due course. He had reached retirement age, and Herbert came, and Herbert was a Dublin man. Herbert was a much younger man, and he began to revamp both the library and the museum. And in 1939, he closed the museum down for several months, reorganised it, and later at the end of the year, he reopened it with the important provision that the opening hours were greatly extended from 6 to 20 hours a week. So Herbert then also did much to expand the collection. He began to bring schools in, and this picture here, this photograph, is from Herbert's period. He remained librarian curator until his death in 1957. He actually was accidentally drowned while out fishing. And so he also added to the collection. And in 1940, he held the first temporary exhibition in the history of the Limerick Museum. It was an exhibition to mark the centenary of the death of Gerald Griffin, the author. And it's interesting to note that at the time, Gerald Griffin would have been, and the newspapers and all carried this in the reports, that he was Limerick's most distinguished author and so on. And of course, poor old Gerald Griffin now was almost totally forgotten. And but at the time, now it wasn't a big exhibition at all, it has to be said. And even the newspaper mentioned that it was I can't remember the exact term, a modest exhibition or a small exhibition, but it was still the first exhibition in the history of the museum. In 1948, an art gallery was added on to the back of the museum, and the librarian, having already been, he was already the city librarian, he was also the curator of the museum. He now, to his list of duties, he added on that of curator of the art gallery. So from 1948 until 1975, you could say the three major public cultural institutions in Limerick were all in Perry Square: the library, the museum and the art gallery. And you could say it was the cultural hub of Limerick at that period. And then in 1953 there was another temporary exhibition curated this time by John Hunt of the Hunt Museum. This is a very interesting detail. When I discovered this in my researches last year, I was very excited because of course we work closely with the Hunt Museum. They're our colleagues and our friends. They're an independent museum, of course, not under the control of the council. But it's interesting to note, and I mentioned this to Jill Cousins, the director, and her colleague Naomi in the Hunt Museum, I mentioned that the collaboration between the two museums goes back to at least 1953, long before the Hunt Museum started to come into existence, because John Hunt curated this exhibition for the museum, and it was part of the Antustal Festival. This had been a festival that was devised in 1953, which didn't last very long, but in Limerick they had what they called an Antustal Civic Exhibition. It was held in the art gallery actually, because the art gallery of course was the biggest space in the museum and art gallery and library and the Carnegie building we'll call it. So John Hunt, he created two tableaus in the space. He recreated a farmer's kitchen of 1853 and 1953 and a Limerick city sitting room, or drawing room I suppose would have been the term, from 1853 and 1953. And it's interesting to note, of course, that in 1953, whereas we'd regard that now, or many people would regard a sitting room or a farmer's kitchen in 1953 as being almost as distant in time from us as the 1853 examples. In fact, there was a lot of commentary about how the progress had been made in the intervening century and all the mod cons that were now available and so on. Space, of course, was a major problem. You had three institutions in one building and they were all expanding. And in 1975, the library was expanding so quickly and so fast that it was felt that it was necessary for it to take over the museum space. So the museum was then closed down for a few years and a search was then undertook to find a new venue for it. Now you can see, like what happened in other in the history of other institutions, that you had the sort of the parent body the library, and then the museum, and then the art gallery, and then at different times, and they actually left the parent body. So, for example, the 1975, the library moved out. Sorry, the museum moved out, and then in 1985, it was actually the library that moved here, and the gallery was left in possession then of the entire building. So there was considerable debate in the 1970s then as to where to house the museum, and eventually, having rejected the idea of using the former St John's Church in John Square, which is now used by Dance Limerick, it was decided to occupy two buildings, two of the houses in John Square. And you see, in 1975, St John's Square had been restored as part of the European Architectural Year, and it was decided that two of the houses could house the museum. And the museum moved there then in 1979. It was reopened there, and it reopened with a very successful exhibition, the Treasures of Thomond, some of you may remember it, where the O'D crosier and mitre and many other artefacts, as well as many objects from the museum's own collection, were put on display. Now, during the period of the closure of the museum from 1975 to 79, there had been a big change in what people now like to call the governance of the body. That's one of the buzzwords now, by the way, in case you want to use it again. The buzzword. It was in 1977 the first curator was appointed to the museum. I actually have a picture from here. Oh, there's Robert Herbert, by the way, the librarian curator of 1938-57. And the first curator then of, the first dedicated curator of Limerick Museum was Larry Walsh. When I say dedicated, I don't mean that that the librarians weren't dedicated. I mean that that was his sole job. He didn't do any other job. And of course, down through the years, the librarians, with the best will in the world, they couldn't devote themselves to running two other institutions as well as the library. So Larry Walsh, you can see, held the position for a very, very long time, for 35 years. So he oversaw the move to John Square. And then there was another move then. John Square was never a success, though it was much too far away from the city centre, and the building itself wasn't suitable. There was a problem with damp and all sorts of things. And then in the mid-1990s, it was decided then that the museum would move to Castle Lane. And this was, of course, because in 1991, King John's Castle had been restored and was reopened, or was opened, I should say, for the first time to the public.
Lord, their powers revoked, their culture marginalised.
And of course, the number of visitors was very high. And it was felt then that the museum, if it moved to the vicinity of John Square, of the castle, that inevitably it would attract more visitors. And to that end, it left the John Square and it moved into Castle Lane, and there it remained for 14 years. Now, again, the number of visitors did increase, all right, but not as much as perhaps they might have expected. But then, in 2012, then there was a further configuration of the display in King John's Castle, and the building in Castle Lane belonged to Shannon Heritage, so they took it back to expand their display, and then the museum then had to leave there, and it then moved to Isterbrack Hall, the City Hall, and there it remained for 5 years until it moved then to its current location. So I'll just finish then by many of you know these pieces, but I'll just very quickly mention the mayoral chair, made in 1897 to mark the 700th anniversary of the first charter in Limerick. Magnificent neo-Celtic piece of furniture. That's our silver room in the museum, and that was one of Larry Walsh's greatest achievements. He collected, in fact, he assembled what effectively is the current collection in the museum. But he also, because I think the number of objects went up from 5,000 when he took over to 60,000 or so, or 55,000 something when he retired. And but he also collected nearly all of our Limerick silver collection. And the Limerick lace collection is also one of the highlights. Ireton's cat is so called because it was found in Ireton's house when it was demolished in 1894. This was a house in Nicholas Street, and the house was called after Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law, who had led the Cromwellian forces to capture the city in 1651. And he had then commandeered this house, which belonged to the Galway family. but it was still called Ireton's house at the time of its demolition over 300 years later in 1890, or sorry, 250 years later in 1894. But the cat was found in the house and in that sort of petrified form, and it was on display in a shop then for a number of years until 1910. It was donated to the museum. And over the years then, of course, we have collected a great many objects relating to the industrial heritage of Limerick. So I'll just finish off then. I'll just basically, there's 4 lines there, but the core mission statement of Limerick Museum is to collect, preserve and display the material heritage of Limerick City and County. And there's an example of our collecting, and there's an example of our displaying. I don't have any image of our preserving, because it's probably, we don't tend to take photographs of that. So that's the end of my talk anyway. Thank you very much.
You did mention that the opening times in Franciscan would be extended. Have you any idea?
I don't at the moment, no. It's just that those discussions are continuing as we speak, so I haven't been told yet, but I'd say we'll hear something certainly within the next few months, I imagine.
Does Kilkenny have a museum, actually?
Kilkenny actually has a museum, but it's an interesting form of governance there. It's actually run by the Civic Trust. But I understand that the Civic Trust in Kilkenny is actually funded by the council. It's not like our Civic Trust, which is independent. So I'm not too sure, but I think it's actually a local authority funded museum, but it's actually governed by the Civic Trust.
All right.
Pat?
Well, Mayor, I'm not sure. As we all know, there's a long line of mayors.
Yes.
When you look at it, you find the two chains.
Yes.
Second in the primary.
Mm-hmm.
Rarely do you see the mayor seated on the particular chair.
That's right.
Showed us there. And I have said that in fact the reason perhaps was that mayors never visited the particular local chamber.
Yes. Very possibly, yes. I suppose.
I've gone from as many photographs as I could, and I don't see the chair featuring at all.
No,
and
I haven't either, actually.
And it should be.
Yes.
And even now, it's the same thing.
Yes. I suppose, certainly in recent, since the amalgamation in 2014, there has been a big decrease in the usage of the robes and of the maces and so on. So I'd say it's probably unlikely that the chair will ever be used again. But there again, we don't know. It doesn't appear to have been used very much. As you say, I've seldom if ever seen an image of the chair in use. So perhaps maybe it was never used. I actually don't know.
It was, because I have a photograph of it, and I will card it.
Okay.
I wrote an old card featuring the two chains and the chair. And it has been greatly admired by people from across, because they immediately look at it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a magnificent Yeah, also a magnificent piece. And it's very much of its time then. The Celtic revival was at height in the 1890s, 1900s. Any other questions?
What would it take to bring the likes of the Ardent Chalice, which is a County Limerick thing, to the museum, items like that?
I say it would be almost impossible, because the National Museum has become very, very strict about lending items, even to other museums. So I would say it's not impossible, but I would say it would be, if it were to be lent, I'd say it would only be for a short time. I could never see it being done on a long-term basis. But again, it is possible.
Security is an issue, isn't it?
Security would be a big issue, yeah. Yes, Derry?
I remember visiting the Limerick Museum in Perry Square in '58.
Oh yes, yes.
When it was upstairs.
Yes.
And then when it went into storage,
Yes.
Certain objects went missing. And the two things I can remember were two pieces from Curragh Chase, a globe,
Yes.
and a French 18th century ladies' writing table, which came
Yes.
from Courage as well, and it was supposed to belong to Marie Antoinette.
Oh, yes,
And
yes.
I know stuff went into storage and never came out, or
Yes.
went to, has there been any attempt to trace that, or do we even have a list of the objects?
Oh, we do. No, we do have
We
an
have a
object.
list.
We have a list of the objects we have now. But to try and relate it back to what we had before, I know that there was for example, there was a burglary in 1969 where items belonging to the Earl of Dunraven were stolen.
There was a
And,
gnome stone there as well, I think.
Yeah.
I'll say, yeah.
Now, when later on, the Earl of Dunraven removed a lot of his objects from the museum, and it's very hard to know really. We're currently doing what's the word? An audit of the collection. But to be fair now, both Larry Walsh and Brian Hodkinson were very meticulous in recording everything. So I'd say it's before their time that the problems may have arisen. It's very hard to know what was there before the catalogue. The actual modern catalogue was established by Larry Walsh in 1978. And of course, he also established the online catalogue then in 2004, which was the first of its type in the state. But it's very hard to trace what was going on before that time. But is it my intention to do so now, it has to be said. But I'm relying a lot on newspaper accounts and things like that, But I went through the minutes now of the council for a lot of that period, and there wouldn't be a whole lot about the museum activities at this period. What was very useful though was a listing of all the visitor numbers, which I didn't mention that last year we had the highest visitor numbers in our entire history, 23,000. But the second highest was in Perry Square in 1965, which goes to prove that it was the location of the museum in intervening 50 years that probably was the problem with regard to visitor numbers, because Perry Square was too small, but it was by far the best location up until now in terms of visitor numbers. But to go back to your question anyway, yes, that would be something I'd like to look at, right, to trace objects that were mentioned by, say, Robert Herbert in 1940, but where they have gone since is anyone's guess. They possibly may have been recovered by their owners as well, who probably had them on long-term loan, Yep.
There used to be an item in the old museum which was a boat.
Oh yes, that's another of them, yes.
A black, ugly...
A dugout canoe.
I'm sure the axe that they found the other day or something like that must have been used to carve it
That's
up.
right.
It was ugly as sin.
That was one of the earliest items that came to the museum, and that is another one now that it's on the missing list as well. But
Is it, yeah?
yeah, but we're working on it.
Do you get many donations now?
Yes, it's actually we get a lot of donations on a regular basis. So our collection, is very, very extensive and continues to grow. And what we, of course, I should have mentioned as well about Larry Walsh that he was. There had been a period that there weren't that many exhibitions, but from his stewardship onwards, then there were a series of temporary exhibitions right through the 70s and 80s and 90s. He had a great many exhibitions. But yes, we continue to I'd say our collection is now up to about 61,000 objects, to be honest with you, And we do purchase now and again as well. But throughout the history of the museum, it has generally been through donations that we have acquired objects.
Matthew, could I just say also that, in case we forget it,
Yes.
that there were some city managers who were supportive.
Oh yes.
I remember I was chairman of the library committee for many years.
Yes.
But Tom McDermott was exceptionally behind the scenes, great behind the scenes.
That's right.
And somebody important as we had Pope, for example, and President Kennedy and so on. But he was always there.
Yes.
Got it. The
Yes.
Chartered Accountant himself.
Yes.
The Sea Scholars in UCC.
Yes.
Limerick
Yes.
was his key.
Yes.
Whereas another manager in the county
Yeah.
was more Cork than Limerick.
Yes. Yes. But you're right there about McDermott, because he was manager, of course, from 1959 to 1970 to 82, I should say. And of course, it was during his period in office that the museum was relocated to John Square, and the first curator was appointed. And of course, none of that obviously could have happened without the backing of the of the manager. And the same was true of earlier periods as well. If you look back at the very beginning of the museum, there was no, the first city manager, of course, was appointed in 1934. But in the town clerk was de facto the manager before that. And there was a man who held that position for 36 years called William Nolan. And he was very interested in the museum in his early days, and he was very encouraging of it. Pat Kennedy, the former mayor, just passed around the card. He's just giving you the card here, you might pass it around. It shows him actually sitting on the chair. So that's an example of the chair in use, you know. So if you want to just have a look at it there and pass it back to you, pass it back in the back of the room.
Went there very well. His silver collection.
Yes.
He bought one. He had a good budget one year. He bought one piece, which was quite expensive. I think it was the mayor's presentation box, the Freedom of the City.
Oh yes, right.
And he was summoned to the council, and one of the councillors, who shall remain nameless, asked him, he said, who authorised the spending of this?
Yes.
And Larry said, you did. He said, okay, move on.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I suppose it's probably unwise to mention names, but I think if anyone can be singled out, I think Larry Walsh was in many respects the creator of the modern museum. Obviously, it was there long before he was born, even. But you know, he assembled a collection that's I suppose through his sheer longevity in the post of curator. Although sadly he didn't live to be very old. He was only 64, I think, when he died. But you know, he was the first full-time curator. And of course, it should be, again, the context is everything. You know, there weren't, even as late as 1977, there were only a handful of local authority museums in the state, and not many of them had a dedicated curator. So again, Limerick, while it mightn't seem as if it was a very significant development, at the same time, the fact that there was a dedicated curator appointed, I think, was a very progressive move, you know. And I think, again, these things should be more widely publicised, because, again, my colleague Una McCarthy mentions the sheer bravery of the council to establish the art gallery in 1948, and to this day there's only 12 local authority museums in the state, but there are even less municipal art galleries or local authority art galleries. I think there's only about 2 or 3, one in Cork, and I'm not sure is the one in Sligo run by the council or not. But certainly they're very thin on the ground. So Limerick should be quite proud of its cultural institutions, because they are quite unusual. Not unusual, rare, I suppose, in the Irish context.
I think a good idea as well is since you're going to pop-up museums that go around the country, making people aware of, you know, because a lot of people West Limerick wouldn't be aware of the museum.
Correct.
But, you know, pop-up museums.
Well, that's a very good point, Tom, because of course this was the city museum was the city museum until 2014. There wasn't a county museum, so we're now the city and county museum. So in order to make ourselves known in the county, we've had a series of pop-up museums to establish our presence in the county as well, and to let people know that they have a museum now. And even apart from that altogether, I think it's a very good idea because pop-up museums, they bring people together, they generate conversations between different people, you know, foster local pride. You know, there's a whole lot of very good outcomes from having these events, you know.
Is there a plan to digitise the items? No, someone.
Oh, they are digitised already. There is a digital catalogue already, actually, in the Limerick Museum.
You said there was 61,000 of them.
Yeah.
The whole lot are digitised?
It's fairly up to date now, but it's not quite up to date. But yes, because Larry Walsh, again, that was one of his achievements. He was the first. It was the first local authority museum in the country to have. And I mean, Larry Walsh was a modest sort of man. He wasn't a flamboyant character. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons why his achievements weren't always as widely recognised as maybe they should have been, you know.
Well, just to add to that, the Matthew
Yes.
Thomas has given a very good idea now, and I think it would be appropriate that Larry Walsh would be remembered in some appropriate way.
Yes, I agree with you, yeah, certainly.
And maybe we could get, this is a good turnout, maybe we could have it conveyed to the mayor and the new managers and so on, that this is what we would like to see happen.
Yeah, excellent, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So, are we We'll leave it at that then, Mike, will we?
Okay, yes, just about 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Matthew. That was,
That's all.
as I suggested to you, it was really interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. When I heard talking Limerick Museum, I thought, I don't know. But like, I should have had faith. I did have faith in Matthew. It was really interesting. And thank you so much, Matthew.